I hadn't called. I had an apple pie in a dish towel, steam still rising, the smell of cinnamon and brown sugar folding into the early light. I tell you that because some betrayals announce themselves with the most ordinary things: a pie, a pair of keys, the exact sound of gravel under tires. I walked up the path to Claire's house, thinking of nothing more complicated than who likes their crust crisper. I had never meant to be the one to upend the cable. There was a silver SUV in the driveway. I knew it by the make and the dent by the rear wheel. That dent Frank had pointed out with an embarrassed laugh months ago. My hand went cold around the pie tin. You learn a lot about loyalty by the way your body responds to little shapes, the set of your jaw, the sudden damp at the corners of your eyes. I stood at the stones, listening. Inside the living room, through the thin glass of their front window, the television hummed a low, familiar note. I could have walked away then, turned back to my properly folded tablecloth and my tidy life. Instead, I leaned closer. The muffled laugh cut the morning air, Claire's voice, bright and light as if nothing were at stake. Then Frank's voice, low and a little too practiced for a man you thought you knew. "I never meant for it to get so complicated," he said. The words skidded and landed like a dropped pie on a driveway. That single line, the casual, almost apologetic tone, made the world buckle under me. I saw the pie in my hand tilt, the apples inside like small suns. I didn't remember dropping it. It simply slipped away, a small domestic thing becoming evidence against me of something I had not yet named. They didn't see me. The curtain fluttered with the air from the vent, the laugh rose again, and the moment was gone. But it had done its work. For 3 years after that morning I said nothing, aloud. I kept the shape of normalcy like a garment you don't yet dare take off. I ate at the same table. I slept in the same bed. I smiled at the same family friends who circulated in and out of our house. I learned that silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is slow work. I learned, too, that silence can be a place to hide or a place to plan. Where are you listening from? Tell me, half out of habit, half because the world felt too intimate that day and I needed to be reminded I wasn't alone. I should tell you, plainly, why I stayed quiet. It wouldn't make me braver or kinder, it would make me clearer. At first it was shock. There was an immediate physical unmooring, like stepping off a curb you misjudged and catching your heel on air. But the reason that held for more than a series of heartbeats was practical. Our son, my son's name is his own in this story, he was not present in the conversation that morning, and he wasn't the architect of the taking, was at the center of the life we'd built. He had a family of his own. Speaking openly, making a scene, accusing his wife in front of everyone, that would have been to reveal fractures I didn't feel ready to repair publicly. There were also the practical matters. I had the sense, absurd and precise, that if I gave voice too early, the opportunity to gather proof would evaporate like steam off that pie. So I learned to move quietly. The first weeks were the worst, sleeping beside a husband who had been a stranger with a face I adored, carrying tea into the room where he'd watch late-night news and wondering how the old drift of his neck had started to seem foreign. I learned to look for small details that might become proof. The whiff of gardenia when Claire came over, the perfume that always seemed to cling to Frank's collar, the way his emails would disappear from his sent folder when he thought no one was looking. I learned to catalog. There are practical things about living with betrayal that television doesn't teach you. You keep the house dusted so that your neighbors will keep thinking things are normal. You smile through holidays while your hands tremble with a secret you refuse to speak. You get better at pacing your breathing so the shake in your voice won't betray you when you answer the phone. You do the boring, steady things because they anchor you when your inner world is a hurricane. As the weeks turned into months and those months folded into seasons, I began to gather what I could. I'm not a thief. I had certain keys. When you are married for decades, you accumulate small permissions, an extra key for the garage, a drawer and a desk that only ever locked for show. I used what was mine. In the study, beneath golf trophies and a stack of unpaid bills, I found things that had nothing to do with clutter and everything to do with intent. Printouts of transfers, an old envelope from the bank with numbers circled in a hurried hand, a list of accounts that did not belong to us. I remember sitting on the floor of that study with the afternoon sun cutting across my knees like a verdict. The paper felt too loud in my lap. It was the sound of a life being counted in numbers. For a woman who had made gifts and planned meals and kept calendars of grandchildren, sums on a balance sheet are almost obscene. But numbers have a way of making betrayal legible. A transfer here, a deleted line there, a notation that said loan when I knew no loan had been requested. I learned to photograph things as if they were small crime scene evidence. My hands, once clumsy with flour and filling, grew precise with a camera. I took photos of bank notices and emails before they could be shredded. I printed pages and stamped dates with a dexterity I never thought I'd need. Evidence, I discovered, is patient. It sits in folders and waits for someone to know how to read it. Elaine came over often in those first months. She had been a friend since before our children were born, one of those steady presences who knows your family's odd rhythms and who can sit in silence without it being awkward. She'd bring soup and leave with a piecemeal hug, sensing, correctly, that there were parts of me I wouldn't show. I told her nothing at first. Eventually, the truth slipped out in smaller, easier pieces. I'm tired, I'd say. I feel a little lost. She made the exact right noises, folded her hands on her lap, offered no advice unless it was asked for. That is, in my experience, the precise shape a friend should take. You don't expect intimidation to come wrapped in sweetness. The first message was gentle, a text from an unknown number that said, "You should let things rest for your son's sake." Another, this time an email, arrived with a photograph of our lawn taken at dusk, the outline of our hedges soft in the light. Someone knocked on the back door once, late at night. It was a neighbor checking on a stray cat. I laughed then, a thin, brittle sound, and told the neighbor to keep the cat if they liked. Later, when I replayed it, I recognized the pattern, small pushes to unsettle, to remind me I was being watched. When Detective Hayes called, months into the silence after the patterns became too regular to ignore, his voice was dry and efficient. He didn't ask me to make declarations, he simply recorded what I knew. "If you receive threats," he told me, "keep them. Don't delete anything. We can only work with what's documented." It is the kind of sentence that makes one feel both tiny and strangely fortified. Keep the evidence, don't manufacture drama. His tone was not kind so much as competent, and there is a particular comfort in that. I did as he asked. I kept voicemails that were empty of content but heavy with intent. I saved screenshots of messages hurriedly apologetic or somehow menacing by omission. I printed letters with dates and timestamps. The stack of paper at my kitchen table grew into a kind of secret architecture, a map of precisely how and where things had been moved.
People think evidence is dramatic, watermarked bank statements, forged signatures caught in a magnifying glass. In truth, most of the work is small and tedious, cross-referencing dates, calling banks to ask what a transfer code meant, making copies until your copier light starts to buzz like a watchful insect. There were social consequences I had not fully anticipated. People noticed the way I stopped accepting invitations, the way I declined to sit at family tables where Claire would be present. Rumors have their own shape, soft at first, then curving into knives that cut in the dark. Someone mentioned that I had become difficult. A neighbor smiled at me with pity that said loud things without making a sound. My husband, meanwhile, resumed his rhythms at home with the practiced ease of someone who believes a silence can be shared without being truly held. Inside, my anger was not helpless heat. It was a clarifying fire. I began to plan like someone learning a new trade. I opened files, literal folders labeled with months and categories. I labeled emails. I categorized transfers. I copied receipts and hid them in places no one would casually look. I learned that organizing grief into documents is a way of staying sane. The seasons, as I said, kept tally. Winter came and brought with it the holidays, and with it rituals that emphasized emptiness as much as presence. I set a place at the table for my son and his family because I was, for reasons that will be obvious to anyone who has loved before breakfast, still a mother who wanted the children to have Christmas cookies and laughter without the rattle of adult dramas. The tree was bright in our living room. The pie dish was stored in a place where only I could see it and would know the mark where an apple had once cracked the glaze. Spring came. I tended the roses because tending something living steadied me. Summer arrived with long evenings and an awareness that I had been saying nothing for more than a year. 2 years. 3. 3 years is not a cinematic stretch. It is a long time to carry a quiet in the chest. I marked it with small, private rituals, a cup of tea at dawn, the making of lists that never saw the light of day, the saving of a single precise photograph of Frank's bank statement that would later become a hinge. There are images you keep because they are anchors. The dent on the SUV, the pie crust broken on a stone driveway, the way sunlight made a little halo on the window where I had stood. I would look at those images when I felt the world tilt. I am aware, as I tell you this, that many would have called the police sooner, would have demanded accounts and answers. Some would have confronted, smashed plates, or walked out. That path was open. I chose another. Not out of cowardice, out of calculation. If you are the kind of woman who has kept tax records and receipts for years, who knows the difference between amortization and a loan, you understand that timing matters. Evidence is a language. In order for it to speak clearly in a courtroom, it has to be assembled the way a conservator assembles a mosaic, patiently, without forcing pieces where they don't fit. And so I found Michael. He wasn't flashy. He sat across from me in a small office that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. His briefcase had seen better days. He had a way of looking at pages that made you think he could read the shape of an intention between the lines. When I slid the first printed bank statement across his desk, he did not gasp. He did not make the small performative noises people imagine lawyers make in films. He made calculations in his head. He asked for dates. He asked for proof of ownership. He asked me to tell him what I wanted. In plain terms, he said, what outcome do you want? It was a pragmatic question that felt almost like a prayer in its honesty. I told him I wanted what was mine returned, that I wanted the accounts corrected, and that I wanted dignity restored.
I did not ask for ruin. I did not ask for spectacle. I wanted to sit at my own table without the feeling that every chair held a trap door. Michael nodded and took notes the way an architect takes measurements, precise, unromantic, essential. He explained the limits without taking the light out of the room. The law, he said, is not a theater. It is a set of instruments. He talked about injunctions and temporary holds and what could be achieved through civil action. We may be able to freeze accounts, he said. We can subpoena records. We can ask for restraint on transfers. His voice was steady and, importantly, cautious. He did not promise the dramatic moment of a judge banging a gavel and life promptly being restored. He offered instead a sequence of deliberate steps. I liked that. It suited the plan I had been nursing in silence. There were small, vindictive attempts to intimidate me in those months where Michael and I built the dossier. A letter arrived with no return address, a neat line of type on cheap paper that suggested I buy peace by staying quiet. A florist sent a bouquet to my door with a note, "You know how this ends if you make trouble." The floral arrangement smelled faintly of the gardenias I had associated with Claire. Someone sent a photograph in the mail of our grandson playing in the yard. Someone else left a voicemail that was all the more terrifying for being a recording of nothing, just a breath, then silence. Detective Hayes noted patterns. He said, "They are turning up the thermostat to see if you'll flinch." I did flinch. I flinched, and then I measured my flinch and turned it into a line item. If intimidation is a tactic, documentation is the counter. I saved each message, printed them, saved them again in 2 different places. I told only a few friends, and only in measured sentences. Secrets, I had learned the hard way, have agency of their own. The fewer you share, the less likely they are to be used as daggers. The son, our son, was a variable I could not control. He loved me, I know he did, in the way that children love the place that raised them. He had his own loyalties, and those are naughty and human. I would not drag him across the page here. It is enough to say he loved us both. He visited less and less. I did not push him when he did. There is a strange mercy in not forcing a child to choose in public the things they are already deciding in private. The months put their marks on bodies and papers alike. My hands grew used to the weight of a camera and a stack of invoices. My alertness grew refined. I could now tell the difference between a normal phone call and the way a manipulative one would breathe around a question. I learned to answer only when I wanted to answer. I learned to make meals that fed me and no one else sometimes. I learned to sleep in the tiny island of my own contentment long enough to stand in the day again. Then came the morning I found the email chain that would change everything. I had been looking for a receipt and found instead a folder labeled Transfers, Claire. The folder had been misfiled beneath a pile of golf magazines, some minor negligence in a life obsessed with order. I almost set it down. Instead, I opened it. There, in a blue ink font that seemed annoyingly neat, were emails that mapped out a pattern, dates, codes, references to accounts I had never heard of. There were shorthand notes, cover for outgoing, move before month end, pad with maintenance. One email referenced a sum that, to my life of modest savings and careful spending, seemed obscene. My hands shook as I photographed each page. The light slanted across the printer ink in a way that made it feel like the words were high-relief carvings. There was an attachment, too, a spreadsheet that listed regular transfers into an account whose owner name matched Claire's maiden name. I sat back on the seat of the study chair and breathed. It is a clinical moment to describe, but it was also a small private fury, the realization that a life had been siphoned not by accident, but by design.
I left the study with my proof in a grocery bag, as if a pie had been inside. The ordinary concealment felt, perversely, right. I put the printed emails and the spreadsheet into a folder and into a locked drawer in my bedroom, where the papers felt like contraband relics. For the next several days, I moved like someone carrying a fragile thing. Every step counted. When I handed Michael the folder, when I watched his face as he read each line, there was a moment where I felt something like relief and grief braid together. He did not seem surprised so much as grave. "This will take work," he said, with the precise kindness of a person who measures the practicalities of pain. He told me about subpoenas and about the possibility of forensic accounting. He cautioned that the other side would likely claim error or misunderstanding. That was obvious. Lies are most effective when they pass as clerical mistakes. "You want to go public?" he asked. I thought of the pie on the driveway that morning, of dropped crust and missing sweetness. I thought of the 3 years of quiet. "No," I said, "not for show, for resolution." That choice, public for resolution, not spectacle, was a turning point. It matters in how the rest of the story unfolds. There are people who would have wanted the drama. There are people who would have wanted vindication served hot. I wanted instead a restoration of boundaries, the return of what was ours, the correction of the accounts, a sense of fairness that had more to do with quiet order than with headlines. But even as we plotted, the pressure increased. Claire started to behave in ways that were both conciliatory and sharp-edged. She would send messages that were almost maternal. "We've been through a rough patch. Let's not let this break the family." And then in person behave as if she owned the layout of our home. Friends came to me unsure whether to mention the dinner parties where our car would sit beside theirs or whether remarking would be rude. Once, at a neighborhood gathering, a woman asked me gently if everything was all right. "You look like you've been holding your breath," she said. I admitted nothing. I told her instead that I was rearranging the garden and laughed too much. The escalation of threats continued. A neighbor found a sugar packet on his porch with our initials written on it, an odd, childish taunt. An anonymous email accused me of making false accusations and warned me to think of our son. The tone was soft and controlling. The aim was obvious: wear me down, make me doubt the worth of what I was doing. There was, too, an attempt at reconciliation that was spiteful for its timing. Frank asked me to meet him in the kitchen one evening as if we had not been living under a cloud. He brought a small vase of gardenias, the scent that had once been sweet on Claire's wrist, and spoke in the voice of someone contrite. "I don't want this to destroy the family," he said. I listened, my hands folded on the counter, and let him speak until the words ran out. "I need time to think," I told him. It was perhaps the kindest lie I had that week. I needed time to think and also to build. Time is a useful ally when the stakes are complicated. It lets you gather more than grief. It lets you gather truth. There were nights when I would sit by the window and watch the streetlight make a pool on the pavement and feel a small animal panic at the shape of my life. Then, slowly, that panic would be converted into work. I learned to make lists of what to ask for, of witnesses to contact, of banks to subpoena for records. I would schedule calls into the evening when the house was quiet, when the hum of the TV from the next room made all human voices seem small. Michael taught me what questions to ask and how to word them so they wouldn't sound like a threat, but rather like a request. When you have been betrayed, language is everything. A legal claim, after all, must be built on careful, defensible words. Friendship held me. Elaine, bless her, became an informal archivist, bringing over labeled envelopes and markers and an ability to sit while I read extracts aloud. "Read the line," she'd say, and I'd read it, my voice like a tool I had learned to use. She would take in the figures and tell me if it sounded like an error or a pattern. In the spaces between our work, we would drink tea and talk about the rose bushes I intended to prune come spring. Those domestic plans felt like small prayers. There were, inevitably, moments of deep loneliness.
You cannot prepare for the way people will change around you when suspicion falls like ash. There were friends who distanced themselves with reasons that were mostly plausible. "We don't want to take sides," one said, and I respected that. I also recognized that silence is contagious. Some people will never speak into the spaces you need them to. The 3-year mark arrived not with fireworks, but with a quiet decision. The winter that closed those years in was a thin, sharp thing. The light in the afternoons had that peculiar quality of an old photograph. I remember standing at the sink, watching the steam rise off the dishwater, and feeling that the time had stopped being only about endurance. It was now time to move. That movement did not feel dramatic. It was a careful rolling forward. One phone call to Michael to ask him to prepare. A second call to Detective Hayes to ensure there would be a record if intimidation turned on its head. A third quick text to Elaine to ask her to come over and bring a pen. I printed every file I had, every bank notice, every email, and arranged them in chronological order. The pile on the table was heavy and honest. It bore the weight of 3 years. It bore the shape of a life being reclaimed. I could have filed the papers that afternoon. I could have stormed the courthouse with those envelopes and demanded that a judge listen and act and right what had been wronged. But I had waited 3 years for a reason. The law is not a vending machine where if you insert enough indignation, justice will automatically dispense. It requires care, patience, and an advocate who knows how to thread the needle. Michael, when I called, told me to come in and bring everything. "We can't do anything public until we have the chain of custody," he said. He met me with a folder already labeled and a calm that felt like a coat to wrap myself in. He did not grandstand. He did not promise miracles. He took my folder, thumbed through pages, and then looked up with a steadiness I had come to rely on. "You're ready," he said. I believed him in the way that someone who has been carrying a burden finally believes that there is a road off the hill. I felt the quiet flattening of my shoulders that comes when you finally set down something you've been holding on to for too long. We planned the first formal steps. We would start by requesting account freezes. We would send polite but firm letters asking for records. We would ask for temporary injunctions. It was not dramatic. It was precise. It was, in its own way, an act of faith. Faith that the law would move as it must when fed with facts. It is one of those human tragedies that even as you prepare the most rational of strategies, your heart will not always accept reason. I had nights when I would wake and see that pie on the driveway and feel again the small, intimate betrayal that had set all the rest in motion.
Then I would remember the stack of papers and the way Michael's eyes had said, in a language without flourish, that it was time. As we left his office with the initial letters ready to send, I felt the same odd mixture of fear and release I had felt the morning I realized the SUV in Claire's driveway belonged to him. The world had shifted, subtly at first, and then all at once. I had stayed silent for 3 years, not to be defeated, but to prepare. The preparation was not vengeance. It was a gathering of facts, a cataloging of wrongs that could be described and corrected. Outside, the street had the ordinary quiet of a weekday. A woman a few houses down watered her geraniums. The neighbor's lawnmower hummed. When I walked back to my car, I passed a bird feeder where a small finch hopped and preened, unconcerned with human affairs. Life kept happening in all its small mercies. There are people who ask, when they hear my story, whether I felt lighter after telling. The truth is complicated. There was no single moment of release, no cinematic key in hand toss into the ocean that erased pain. Instead, there were decisions, documents, and days of work that built a pathway toward restoration. There were also losses that could not be retrieved. Trust, time, the easy domestic unquestioningness of companionship. When I tucked my folder back into the glove compartment of my car, the paper rustled like a small, persistent bird. The roads to come were uncertain. There would be more letters, more days of waiting, more small, petty attempts to unsettle me. There would be moments, many, where I would have to remember why I had chosen this slow, methodical path. I chose it because the truth has more staying power than a shouted accusation. That evening at home, I placed the pie tin on the counter as if it were a relic. The mark where the crust had broken was a reminder, yes, but it was also a talisman. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and began to make a new list. Witnesses to call, bank names to subpoena, dates to pin down. Elaine came over and we sat side by side in the living room, the TV a mute blue glow, and she held my hand without pressing. "You did all the right things," she said. "You were patient." I will not pretend that patience feels noble in the moment. It feels like waiting for a machine to finish grinding metal, loud, repetitive, and interminable. But patience allowed me to stitch together a story that the law could hear. It allowed me to turn grief into files and suspicion into evidence. It allowed me finally to cross the line from being the passive object in this little domestic tragedy to being an actor, someone who could speak in a courtroom and ask for what is fair. We had not reached the courthouse yet. There were hearings to come, maneuvers by the other side I could not foresee, small, mean attempts to unsettle witnesses and question my motives.
There would be a moment when, in public, the details would be displayed and the house of my life would be laid bare for a neutral to inspect. I have learned that courts prefer facts and resist drama, so I kept gathering facts. On the kitchen counter, the pie dish was washed and dried. The apple smell lingered like an accusation and a memory both. I tucked it into the cabinet where everyday things live, and for a moment let myself imagine the sea. The sea is a far-off decision. It is the place I would later go to when the legal work had its result and I needed to remake a life with quieter elements. The billow of salt air, the sound of gulls, the way sunlight breaks differently on a shore. For now, its image is a distant, soothing promise rather than a present reality. At night, I made lists and made phone calls. I relayed instructions to Michael about which documents were original and which were copies. I checked bank account numbers until my eyes blurred. The work was meticulous and sometimes maddening, but it was honest. It was a purifying force. And then, on a late spring morning, 3 years to the week from the day the pie left my hands, I received a message that made the air in my chest change. Michael called me with a voice that had, for once, a note of reserved excitement. "We have enough," he said. "We have a plausible chain, and we can ask the court to act." I put my hand over the telephone like someone covering a small, fragile thing. The rest of the day hummed with the sound of sheets being shuffled and the low, steady square of preparation. I packed the folder with care, imagining it like a small, obdurate seed. When I drove to his office that afternoon, the sun was a precise sliver. I remember the gravel crunching under the tires, an echo of the morning at Claire's house, and a small private thought flashed through me. The world will remember the way it felt when the apple pie fell. It would be a small truth, nothing theatrical, but sometimes small truths are all we need to start a larger correction. I walked into Michael's office with a quiet that had been 3 years in the making. He closed the door behind us and laid out the first letters. "After this," he said, "we'll file. Once it's public, things will move quicker, but also messier. Are you prepared for that?"
I sat down, feeling the chair as a physical support and a moral one. I had prepared, I had waited, I had organized grief into proof, but I had not yet stepped into the public place where the whole thing would be judged. That moment was what the coming days would be about. We prepared the filings, we gathered the supporting affidavits, we checked and double-checked everything a dozen times. My hands were steady now when I signed a page. The signature felt like the closing of a door and the opening of another. There was a tiny tremor around me, as if everything I had held back had finally breathed out.
It was almost, in that small moment, possible to imagine the courthouse steps and the sound of a gavel. It was almost possible to picture the end of this particular chapter. But life, in its intelligent, stubborn way, was not finished with me yet. There would be letters and counters to the counters, and the mild malice of those who think silence equals surrender. There would be more small attempts to frighten me, small attempts to buy silence with kindness, and perhaps the bitter comedy of people who pretend nothing is wrong, even as the ledger tells a different story. As I left Michael's office with the folder closed and the first formal letters ready to send, I felt the brittle relief of someone who has arranged the pieces on a chessboard but not yet made the opening move. The outside air tasted of rain and something like potential. I knew with a clarity that came from long practice that what I had done would not make everything whole. It would not bring back the easy stuff, but it would, I hoped, bring the possibility of order. It would give me back a table where what belonged to me sat clearly and not as a shadow behind someone else's claim. The next morning I would take the letters to the post and send them into a network of banks and custodian services. I would sit with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea and wait to see what the other side would do. There would be denials, probably, and perhaps counterclaims about ingratitude or misunderstanding. Those things are ordinary. They are small, human defenses against shame. What I did not yet know was how public the hearing would become, nor how the town would watch. I did not yet know which friends would stand with me in court and which would shrink away. I did not know whether our son would come to sit by my side or whether he would be pulled into someone else's orbit. Those are stories for the pages to come. For now I drove home with the folder in the passenger seat, the paper rustling like a small, satisfied animal. The suburban streets passed by in familiar patterns, mailboxes, azaleas, the occasional dog trotting with intent. I parked in my driveway and sat for a long time with my hands on the wheel, feeling the quiet settle like dust. 3 years of silence had been an investment. The first installment had been made. Inside the house, I washed my hands slowly, feeling the warmth of water on the skin. I stood for a moment in the kitchen with the clean pie tin on the counter, and then I opened the drawer where I kept a spare key. I held that key, mundane, silver, ordinary, between my fingers like something symbolic. It had been in my life for a long time. It had opened drawers of bills and cabinets of china, and once, perhaps, the door to a place where everything felt secure. I had plans to leave one day for the sea. That was still a future. For now, the key went back into the drawer. I closed it gently and sat down at the cable. The phone was quiet. The house hummed. Outside, somewhere in the world, a gull called, and the sound felt absurdly like a benediction. There will be more to tell, hearings and public reckonings, and the work of moving boxes out of a house that will no longer be a home in the same sense it had been. There will be the slow, steady unmaking and remaking of a life. For now that unmaking had a plan. The plan had a folder. The folder had dates. I slept that night with the folder under my pillow.
When I woke, the dawn was a thin line, and the sun traced a small, sharp light over the kitchen table where the documents lay like quiet witnesses. I made tea, then toast. I folded the towel with automatic care, and finally walked out the door. The gravel under my shoes sounded the way it had 3 years ago. The world did not seem to notice that anything had changed, but something had. The shape of my silence had shifted from refuge to weapon. It was not a weapon of pain, it was a tool of recalibration. And so I began to move. And so I began to move. The first letters went out like small, steady ships into a gray sea. They were polite in form and grave in content. Formal requests for records, notices of intent, a demand for interim relief. Nothing about them was dramatic. They were the sort of documents that make a lot of noise in the right places and very little at the kitchen table. I mailed them with a practiced hand, then sat with a cup of tea and counted my breaths until my pulse stilled. Predictably, the other side replied with the language of modest shock. Clerical error, one letter said. A misunderstanding, another insisted. There were pleas that read like scripts written to a sympathetic ear, misfiled maintenance, mistaken memos, the tired claim that money had been moved in good faith and promptly accounted for. Those phrases were familiar. Lies often dress themselves in apology and paperwork. Michael did not raise his voice. He raised questions. He subpoenaed ledgers. He subpoenaed account histories. He insisted on a forensic audit. Forensic accounting sounds like an implacable phrase, fit for television. In practice, it meant late calls with analysts who spoke of debits and credits in a wry, almost tender language. It meant spreadsheets that nested into other spreadsheets and many, many small reconciliations. It meant a small army of numbers bringing with them a bluntness I found comforting. They don't pretend, they only add. Discovery unfolded like seasons. There were days when the work was technical and dull, faxed ledgers, printed email threads, the soft abrasion of pages sliding into folders. There were other days that felt like ambushes, a deposition where memory proves elastic and human details bend away from the facts, the challenge of listening to a man you had loved answer questions about account signatories with the faintly amused look of someone playing at confusion. I sat in a witness chair once, my hands on my lap, and watched as a portrait of a life I recognized slid, detail by detail, into the glare of cross-examination. It was odd to feel exposed, and yet oddly right. There is a peculiar dignity in speaking the small truths that keep your days in order. There were witnesses who refused to speak, bank clerks who said privacy laws prevented comment, neighbors who demurred with a sympathetic, "I think you should work this out privately." There were others who spoke plainly. The bank officer who had flagged an irregular pattern and kept his notes, the accountant whose careful cross-checking had revealed irregular transfers. Those facts were small anchors that Michael shaped into a narrative. Repeated transfers mislabeled as maintenance, checks written to shell accounts, signatures that under light and scrutiny looked less like a single handwriting and more like a collection of hurried marks. At one point, Michael asked Detective Hayes to open a harassment file linked to the anonymous threats. Hayes was efficient. He took the stack of voicemails and the printed messages with the professional distance of someone accustomed to small cruelties. He photographed the envelopes, logged the metadata on the emails, and quietly told me where best to store the originals. His presence in the case was an odd comfort. There is a reassurance in the methodical taking of note that feels almost like a recipe for order. There were days when the pressure sharpened into something that felt personal. Notices would arrive saying an account had been closed. A cable company would claim equipment missing. Someone would walk into a grocery store where a neighbor stood and the neighbor would abruptly turn away. Social life, which had once been a simple traffic of invitations and small talk, split into currents I did not navigate. Invitations ceased. People with kindness in their eyes chose neutrality as an antidote. It is a specific loneliness to be accused, in effect, of choosing sides simply by pursuing what is yours. The sun? He remained the quiet orbit around which other things turned. He called sometimes in clipped, careful moments, what sounded like a man trying not to be used as leverage. I did not ask him for loyalty on the record. Children of grown age belong to themselves and to the messy adult choices that shape their days. I only wanted, at the base level, that he not be pulled into the center of a legal crucible. That request, perhaps selfish, was also practical. Depositions and public hearings are not kind to private families. I loved him enough to let his decisions remain his. Depositions took place in cramped rooms with sour coffee and legal pads. Opposing counsel had a practiced, soft-voiced way of asking obvious questions as if the obvious answers were hidden. "Do you recall this date?" they'd say, and I would. "Did you ever see this signature before?" They'd ask, and I would point to a sheet and say what my 2 decades of bookkeeping and attention had noticed. The strokes were wrong here, the pressure changed there. It was not a dramatic revelation so much as the steady work of being incontrovertibly careful. Michael would sit beside me and give nothing away with his face. His questions were surgical and precise, and I trusted him as I had trusted few men in suits to keep the drama at bay. The other side's strategy was to make the story about personality. "She's jealous," an email suggested. "She's litigious," another alleged. That, we discovered, was a familiar play. When facts are a threat, character assassination becomes a defense. We did not respond with moralizing. We responded with balances and dates and certified statements. Numbers have a pragmatic ruthlessness. They can be dry, but they are efficient. They are the sort of evidence the law values when emotion might otherwise cloud judgment. As the file thickened, the tone of the town shifted. People who once passed the time of the day now offered clipped smiles. A woman at my book club looked at me across the table and said, "It must be hard." I did not correct her when she assumed publicly. There is a strange economy to small talk. It can reveal the soft centers of people while hiding awkwardness. But there were also pockets of kindness. Elaine, always, and a neighbor who left me a batch of scones with a note that read, simply, "Thinking of you." Small acts of care, mundane and concrete, kept me tethered. Then the court date arrived, an ordinary calendar entry that felt enormous when read aloud. It announced a hearing on temporary injunctions, the initial step toward freezing accounts and insisting on a turnover of records. It was not the final adjudication. The law moves methodically like tide upon rocks, but this hearing would be public. It would bring the ledger of our private life into a room where strangers in robes and suits and clerks would measure it. The morning of the hearing, the town wore itself in ordinary clothes. The courthouse smelled of coffee and old varnish, a scent I associated with adult responsibilities and the muted gravity of civic offices. The fluorescent lights made everything flatter, less like a memory and more like a document. I wore a coat that was not new and a scarf that smelled faintly of lavender, something Elaine had insisted upon for steadiness. When we arrived, there were the usual small dramas, a man arguing about parking, a woman whose earrings reminded me of the summer at my mother's house. Those details, trivial, felt like a clutch of normality in an otherwise peculiar morning. Michael walked in with the folder like a shield. He had, in his own quiet way, assembled the narrative we would present. Bank statements, email chains, the spreadsheet that linked transfers to an outside account, and a chronology that mapped years into months and months into days. He had exhibits labeled and organized so that a layperson could follow the thread. The truth, if presented simply, is harder to deny. When we entered the courtroom, I felt briefly that odd vertiginous sensation of being both very small and intimately known. The judge, a woman who wore a measured expression and kept her hair tied back, listened when Michael described the case in simple terms. He did not inflate it. He named the relief we sought: temporary freezes, production of records, and order preventing further transfers. He gave the other side the chance to respond. Frank's attorney spoke in the tone of mild surprise that characterized much of the defense. Clerical errors, misunderstandings, an explanation that paper alone could not convey motive. Claire's attorney offered a soft plea about family privacy, about the harm that publicity could engender. What Michael did in that room that day was to make the complex seem plain. He laid out a timeline and then drew a line between dates and amounts and account names. He placed the spreadsheet on the table as if offering a map and said simply, "These are transfers repeated and consistent. These are not one-off mistakes. This is a pattern that corresponds to a narrative prepared to take funds repeatedly under the guise of maintenance." There are small, telling gestures in any courtroom. A juror might shift. A clerk might look up. In our case, the defense's composure unspooled in small ways. Voice tones strained. An answer wavered. A counsel attempted to suggest that some entries had been authorized. Michael showed signatures that, under light and comparison, showed curious consistencies with one another and inconsistencies with the known flow of the narrator's living expenses. The judge leaned forward in a way that meant she now saw what Michael wanted her to see. Not motive, not malice, but pattern. The law, at its best, wants order. The spreadsheet gave it that. The request for temporary relief was granted. Accounts were frozen. A preliminary order limited further transfers. It was not victory so much as a safe harbor, a legal acknowledgement that the facts before the court warranted caution. I remember the weight lifting a notch, like a long-held breath exhaled. It was not the end. It was, however, a critical hinge point. The legal machine, once engaged, had to be fed with its proper inputs: depositions, subpoenas, forensic reports. There followed weeks that felt like the slow migration of weather. The forensic accountants reported their findings in voices precise and unromantic. They had traced streams of money into accounts that bore Claire's maiden name, and in some instances into accounts that were newly opened and little used. They showed paper chains where the funds had been moved through several custodial accounts, clever, functional, designed to obscure. The report did not cry vengeance. It listed sums. It identified transfers and dates. It offered an audit trail so ordinary and stern that it was almost consoling in its flatness. "Here it is," we said. "You can follow the line and see where it leads." During discovery, the defense attempted to paint me as the architect of a misunderstanding. They questioned motives. They suggested that in an old marriage, money shifts happened without malice and that a misunderstanding could have easily been remedied. There are people who will always prefer a fiction of naivete to the discomfort of confronting deliberate wrongdoing. Michael did not flinch. He produced the email chain with the subject lines that read like shorthand confessions: pad with maintenance, transfer before month end, cover for outgoing. There were plain phrases, clumsy, human, used in a context that made motive plausible. Motive is often a matter of context more than confession. These emails provided a context that the court could not ignore. On the day the judge ruled on the substantive matter, the sun was low and the courthouse felt heavier, more consequential. I sat in the back row with my hands folded. My fingers were comfortable with the velvet of the chair. I listened to the reading of the findings with an odd mix of detachment and quiet intensity. The judge's voice was careful as she summarized the evidence, the repeated transfers, the emails that coordinated timing and labeling, the audit trail that traced funds to an account bearing the defendant's family name. She noted the harassment evidence, the anonymous messages, the intimidating gestures archived and presented, and said that such conduct undercut claims of a mere misunderstanding. She did not use the word evil. Judges rarely use such dramatic language. She used instead words of equity, restitution, disgorgement, assignment of certain assets. The order specified a return of improperly transferred funds where recoverable, a division of certain joint accounts to correct misappropriations, and a restraining measure to prevent further depletion. There was a line that awarded me possession of the house that had been our family home, on the grounds that the house's title and encumbrances were entangled in the disputed accounts, and in order to secure restitution, the court found it equitable to assign the property. It was a practical remedy, not a moral verdict. It returned a certain order to property and to accounts. People imagine verdicts as bright, cinematic moments. What this felt like was careful, sober, and in a small way inevitable, the law's tendency to tidy when presented with tidy facts. The relief was practical and substantial. It did not erase the years. It did not bring back the illusions of a complacent domestic life. It restored, in a measured way, ownership and order. After the ruling, there were the small, complicated fallouts. Frank and Claire left town shortly thereafter. The house keys, once a trivial possession, had to be turned over and then reclaimed. There were arrangements to inventory and remove belongings. There were discussions about the care of grandchildren and about how to untether relationships from transactional motives. Some neighbors pretended nothing had changed. Others spoke their sympathy in ways that tried to repair the social fabric. I did not pursue retribution beyond what the court had provided. The order had done what I had hoped, set things right as far as could be set, and placed a legal guardrail against future transfers. In the weeks after the verdict, I moved through the house like someone clearing a cathedral. There was an almost ceremonial element to what I did, packing boxes, sorting the manageable from the unsalvageable, deciding which objects were memory and which were ballast. I found in the attic a shoebox with letters my son had written at 13, awkward, earnest, and utterly lovable, which I kept. I found things that were, in their ordinariness, tender, an worn apron with grease stains where I had once cooked for friends, a chipped mug with someone's initials, the small silver key that had, for a long time, lived beneath a drawer. I did not stage a moment of revenge. I boxed Frank's golf trophies and some shirts and set them aside for collection if they wished. I left for myself the things that read like my life, my mother's yellowed recipes, photographs of the children at the beach, Eliane's handwriting on the margin of a page with garden advice. Clearing out was not catharsis so much as a patient unhooking. I labeled boxes with domestic pragmatism: keep, donate, store, remember. There were journalists who called, curious about the small-town drama. I declined to make a spectacle. I answered when necessary with the same restrained clarity I had brought to the legal process. I had been wronged. The court had corrected those wrongs as it could. I refused the sensational headlines that might have made my pain into entertainment. There is a dignity in quiet resolution, and I wanted nothing to do with shrillness. When the house was mostly empty, the key felt heavier than it had any right to. I had never thought a small piece of metal could carry such freight. One morning, late in the light of spring, with boxes stacked and a pile of unsent holiday napkins beside the counter, I took the key outside. The driveway still had the indent made by that silver SUV. The dent in the wheel well remained a small witness to a morning that had set years in motion. I held the key like a relic, and then, after a moment that was equal parts ritual and release, I set it in a drawer and let it rest. I did not throw it yet. The sea was a plan, not an action. The move to the coast was practical and healing in the way small simplicity can be. I rented a cottage where the woods smelled faintly of salt and the windows let in a wind that made the curtains behave like waves. The ocean was very ordinary most mornings, gulls rehearsing their calls, fishermen on the jetty, a woman walking a dog that always seemed to look like mischief. The salt air healed small things in a way that was both literal and metaphorical. Laundry dried faster, the breath seemed cleaner, grief, given room, took on a less sharp edge. I started the blog, The Quiet Table, not as a bid for notoriety, but as a way of translating what had been a private practice into a public conversation. The blog's first entries were practical: how to organize financial documents, the importance of keeping originals, a list of questions to ask your bank. Those posts were the scaffolding for later, gentler pieces, a reflection on the etiquette of family dinners when a fracture sits beneath the tablecloth, a piece about the surprising companionship of a low-grade morning rain. People began to write back. The email inbox, which had once been a place that delivered threats, became a place that delivered messages of solidarity. "I thought I was alone," one woman wrote. "Your post about keeping a simple ledger saved me," another said. Those small human replies were currency, different from money and more sustaining. I wrote not to reclaim a public stage, but to offer practical bearings to those walking similar paths. I edited posts late at night, my laptop open on the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling beside me. Elaine would send comments and suggest titles in the voice of a friend who knows both your strengths and your blind spots. Michael occasionally read and offered the occasional technical clarification. "Civil procedure," he would remind with dry amusement. The Quiet Table evolved into a community. People shared stories there, recipes, lists of attorneys and forensic accountants, a sense of practical empowerment that made me feel less alone. There were days when I still felt the tilt of the trail. There were days, especially at first, when the smell of gardenia on a passerby would fold into a memory like a photograph. But those moments softened with time. The sea will do that. It will rearrange rawness into a smoother shore. I took long walks and let the wind pick at the edges of my anger. I began, slowly, to understand that freedom is less a dramatic severing than a quiet detachment. The small rituals that had sustained me, making lists, protecting evidence, cataloging every bank notice, found new uses. I began to write about the strange dignity of small tasks. People resonated with the everydayness of survival: how to fold a towel with precision, how to label a box, how to sit with a cup of tea when your mind wants to race. Those sorts of instructions are not glamorous, but they are the scaffolding of ordinary recovery. As readers wrote in, I occasionally heard from women with stories more acute than my own. They asked about resources. They asked about how to approach an accountant if they'd never kept receipts. I started to compile links and names, nonprofits, elder protection hotlines, financial legal clinics, and I made a sidebar on the blog for people looking for practical help. It was a small thing, a single click that might direct someone to counsel or a support group. It felt like the right kind of reaching out, specific, quiet, useful. There was, over the next year, a slow unraveling of the more personal stitches that tied us to the past. Frank wrote one letter, halting and full of old habit, that I returned unread. Claire sent a message that read like a perfunctory apology. I chose not to reply. Replaying wounds in an attempt to gain moral high ground is an indulgence I never wanted. I had asked the court for restitution and for order. I had received it. That was sufficient. The house finally sold through the processes the court had put in place, and the proceeds were used, as the judgment directed, to satisfy outstanding obligations traced through the misappropriations. There were practicalities to attend to: tax forms, accountants' fees, the quiet arithmetic of what belonged to whom. These were not stories for public retellings. They were, thankfully, the business-like tasks that signal a literal untying. They moved with the slow dignity of processes that are less interested in drama than in accuracy. One morning, months after the move, I took the small silver key out from where I had stored it and walked to the shoreline. The tide was low and the gulls were distracted with small treasures. I could have kept the key as a memento, an object lesson in caution. I could have hammered it into a shadow box and hung it on the wall as a relic of a hard lesson. Instead, standing with the raw air in my face and the sand cool beneath my shoes, I let the key slip from my fingers. It did not make a splash the way you'd imagine. It made a soft sound as it met the shallows and then rolled a little in the tide, catching the sun. The gesture was not theatrical. The key did not have the finality of a Pyrrhic triumph. It had the honesty of a small, private letting go. I watched it glint and then sink under the shallow water and felt, unexpectedly, a small sense of permission to be done with the object itself. Freedom, I realized, is often the absence of the urge to reclaim something that no longer deserves your attention. There is a stubborn myth that justice is the moment of public spectacle. In my case, justice was the slow assembly of facts, the patient cataloging of truth, and a quiet courtroom that set things right in a way the neighbors could not unravel by gossip. There was no cinematic vindication, no triumphant shout outside the courthouse. There was, instead, a series of small acts that culminated in a legal writing: accounts frozen, transfers reversed where possible, restitution ordered, and a practical redistribution of property that allowed me to step away. The quiet table, by then, had a small readership. People wrote to tell me their own stories, to ask practical questions, and sometimes simply to say thank you. Those messages were not trophies. They were proofs of something simpler and more luminous, that speaking with care and evidence can make an echo in other people's lives. I began to host a monthly online gathering, nothing elaborate, coffee and conversation over a video call for people who needed a place to be heard without being judged. They called themselves The Table. We did not preach, we listened. If an occasional lawyer or accountant dropped by to answer technical questions, it was a generous moment, not a performance. Every so often, a reader would write and say, "How did you know how long to wait?" They wanted a rule, a formula. I had none. Waiting, in my case, was not a suspension devoid of action. It was an intermission filled with paperwork and the slow building of evidence. It was a disciplined patience designed to ensure that when I did speak, the law would hear me. That is a strategy, not a virtue. It worked for me because I could calculate and because I had the resources, friends, counsel, the patience to see it through. Not everyone will have the same options, and there is no one-size-fits-all morality to the timing of disclosure. That is something I make a point of saying in posts. Seek counsel early, document everything, and do not be shamed into silence because people prefer comfort over truth. Life, as life does, reassembled itself in quiet ways. I learned to bake again, not as an instrument of proof, but as a pleasure. Scones instead of elaborate pies, muffins instead of intricate lattice-top crusts. I learned to make friends at the shore who were not connected to my past. I planted a small vegetable bed and an herb pot on the porch that I tended with a companionable obsession. The mundane rhythms of watering and pruning became an antidote to the old sharp edges of grief. If there is a final lesson in this part of my life, it is not about punishment or public spectacle. It is about precision and dignity. It is about the way a woman, some of us older, some of us quietly fierce, can set a table with facts and call the law to do what it can. There were things the law could not mend: time, the ease of easy domestic confidence, the sense that a life could be unexamined, but it could correct ledgers, provide restitution where possible, prevent further depletion. That mattered. When people ask me whether I'm happier now, I say this: I am steadier. My days have more ballast. The ocean does not banish memory, it softens its edges. I wake to the sound of gulls and to the ordinary rituals of mourning. I read the messages from readers, and I know there are lives that have been steadied by small acts of documentation and by the courage to consult a lawyer. I know that not everyone will choose the path I chose, and that is as it should be. There are many ways to survive and many ways to reclaim a life.
If anything, the story I tell now is less about triumph and more about language, how to turn an ache into an account and an accusation into an itemized list the law can act upon. If you are listening and you suspect something similar, an odd transfer, a pattern that does not make sense, document it. Keep originals, photograph notices, save messages, find a trusted friend or an advocate. When you are ready, find counsel who will speak plainly and ask for what you want, because the law is most effective when it has clarity rather than rhetoric. Before I go, a small note. If this story has touched something in you, if it has felt like a mirror or a warning, visit the Quiet Table. There you'll find resources, a list of legal aid organizations, a primer on preserving financial records, and a modest community of people who have learned how to stitch their private lives back into something steady. There is no single answer in these pages, only tools and the company of those who have been where you might be. I suppose the last image I will leave you with is that of the key underwater, its small glint gone from sight and not needed anymore. For 3 years I stayed silent while my son and his wife took what they could. I did not make the silence a surrender, I made it a strategy, and when the moment came, I spoke with the weight of careful files and steady counsel. The result was not vengeance, but restoration. The outcome was not loud, but it set a new order. The sea taught me, slowly and gently, that freedom often arrives not as a shout, but as the quiet absence of a thing you no longer have the urge to clutch. Tell me where you're listening from, if you wish, and if you need a place to start, the Quiet Table will be there, full of practical steps and people who have been quietly working their own ways back to shore.